The champagne silk of her nightgown felt less like a comfort and more like a gilded chain tonight. Catherine sat perfectly still on the edge of the sprawling bed, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she listened to the suffocating silence of the room. It was the only proof she was still breathing inside this immaculate illusion. The bedroom was designed for royalty, with its floor-to-ceiling windows framing Seoul's electric, diamond-studded skyline, but despite the picture-perfect framed wedding photo on the nightstand, she had never felt more isolated. For the 1,460th night in succession, Jang Hook stood across the room in his dark, tailored suit, his broad back turned to her as he stared out at the city, avoiding her eyes completely. 4 years, 48 months of marriage, and she could list on her fingers the moments her mild-mannered accountant husband had reached for her with anything beyond rehearsed, polite courtesy. Not the raw fire she hungered for, not the deep connection husband and wife were meant to forge, not even a glance at the beautifully wrapped gift resting untouched on the duvet behind her. Catherine tightened her grip, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders, and shifted her gaze toward his distant silhouette against the glass's cold brilliance. Their penthouse commanded views that whispered of a quiet, mundane safety, shielding her in a life of unimaginable comfort. Before we dive into the explosive truth of Catherine's marriage, please subscribe and comment where you are watching from. But everyone who envied her perfect life didn't know the secret. Even the safest, most exquisite illusion was still a prison. Catherine had learned to measure time in the quiet, lonely spaces between them, entirely unaware of the lethal syndicate boss lurking just beneath her husband's skin. The afternoon sun felt heavy as it filtered through the large windows of the artisanal café downtown, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold brilliance of her penthouse. Catherine traced the rim of her ceramic mug, seeking comfort in the mundane chatter of the patrons around her. It was her only escape from the suffocating silence of her marriage, a brief respite from the ghost of the man she called her husband. She checked her watch. Jang Hook was supposed to be at his accounting firm, buried in spreadsheets and corporate tax law, safely tucked away in his predictable, unexciting world. The first gunshot didn't even register as violence. It sounded like a sharp crack of thunder, followed instantly by the explosive shattering of the storefront window. A shower of jagged glass rained down over the velvet booths, mirroring the splintering of her quiet life. Catherine was thrown to the floor by the sheer force of a panicked patron rushing past, her ears ringing as the cafe erupted into absolute chaos. 3 men stormed through the ruined entrance. They were dressed entirely in black, their faces concealed by tactical masks, clutching heavy, suppressed weaponry. This wasn't a random robbery. Their eyes swept the room with terrifying precision, locking directly onto the alcove where Catherine cowered behind an overturned oak table. Her breath hitched in her throat, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, just as it had in her lonely bed. They were looking for her. One of the enforcers raised his weapon, the dark barrel pointing straight at her trembling form. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. Instead, the deafening crunch of breaking bone echoed through the space. Catherine opened her eyes to a spray of crimson painting the pristine white floor tiles. The man who had aimed at her was crumpled on the ground. Standing over him, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace, was Jang Hook. But this was not the quiet, distant accountant who avoided her gaze for 4 years. His bespoke suit jacket was gone, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled up to expose forearms, corded with muscle and smeared with fresh blood. Another assailant lunged. Jang Hook didn't flinch. He pivoted, stripping the weapon from the man's grasp with blinding speed before driving a brutal, lethal strike into his attacker's chest. He moved like a shadow, a ruthless predator unleashed, his strikes calculated, devastating, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Within a matter of seconds, the 3 heavily armed men were neutralized, their bodies completely still amidst the ruins of the café. The silence that followed was heavier than any they had ever shared in their gilded bedroom. Jang Hook slowly turned to face her, the weapon now resting easily in his grip. His dark eyes, usually so careful to look past her, locked onto hers with an intense, possessive fire. The polite facade was utterly obliterated. Katherine stared up at her blood-stained husband, realizing with absolute terror that the safe, mild-mannered man she married was an illusion, and the monster beneath had finally bared his teeth. The heavy steel doors of the armored SUV locked with a deafening thud, severing Katherine from the life she thought she knew. The ride away from the blood-soaked café was a blur of adrenaline and suffocating silence. Beside her sat the stranger wearing her husband's face. Jang Hyuk stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, the pristine white of his torn shirt stained with the rust-colored evidence of the lives he had just extinguished with his bare hands. They left the glittering skyline of Seoul behind, winding deep into the forested outskirts until massive wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling, brutalist estate. Heavily armed men in tactical gear patrolled the perimeter, their eyes tracking the vehicle with predatory vigilance. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress. The moment he ushered her inside the cavernous, dimly lit foyer, the shock paralyzing her veins ignited into a blinding, desperate fury. She ripped her arm from his grip, the fabric of her coat slipping from her shoulders. "Don't touch me," she screamed, the raw sound echoing off the cold stone walls. Her voice trembled, not from the lingering terror of the ambush, but from the monumental weight of his deception. 4 years? 48 months you let me believe you were just a quiet, boring accountant. Who are you? What is this place? Jang Hyuk didn't cower or offer the rehearsed polite apologies that had defined their entire marriage. That facade was completely gone, replaced by a dark, suffocating authority. He closed the distance between them with a predatory grace that made her breath catch, cornering her against the heavy mahogany doors. "This place," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly timbre she had never heard before, "is the only reason you are still breathing." "You lied to me." Katherine struck his chest, her fists hitting solid, immovable muscle. Tears of profound betrayal streamed down her face, ruining her perfectly applied makeup. "Day after day, night after night in that penthouse, you looked past me. You made me feel invisible, like I wasn't enough while you were hiding a war zone. You're a monster." He caught her wrists effortlessly in one hand, pinning them flat against his chest. The proximity was both terrifying and strangely electric. For the first time since they exchanged their vows, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a burning, unyielding possessiveness that stripped away all her defenses. "I am a monster," he confessed, stepping so close she could feel the dangerous heat radiating from his skin. "I built an empire of blood, Katherine, and I built a perfect, quiet glass cage to keep you completely untouched by it. But they found you." His grip tightened, not to hurt, but to anchor her to his violent reality. "The accountant is dead. Welcome to my world. You are never leaving my sight again." The heavy oak doors of her new confines remained unlocked, a dangerous invitation Katherine couldn't ignore. When she finally ventured out of the sprawling, sterile bedroom, the sheer magnitude of Yang Huk's reality struck her like a physical blow. The compound was a labyrinth of cold concrete, reinforced steel, and tinted glass, humming with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a military black site. Men in sharp suits and earpieces moved with purpose through the corridors, parting instantly as she approached, their heads bowed in deferential silence. She was no longer just a wife. In their eyes, she was the undisputed property of their king. Following the low murmur of voices, Katherine found herself standing at the threshold of a cavernous command center. Wall-to-wall monitors bathed the darkened room in a harsh blue glow, displaying real-time surveillance of shipping ports, underground casinos, and political offices across Seoul. This wasn't merely a gang, it was a sovereign shadow economy. And at the center of it all stood Yang Huck, orchestrating the movement of millions and the fates of thousands with a single, ruthless command. But it wasn't the scale of his criminal empire that anchored her feet to the floor. It was the isolated cluster of screens on the far wall. Katherine moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. Dozens of monitors were dedicated entirely to her. There was footage of her sipping coffee at the artisanal café, reading by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, and walking through the city streets. Beside the screens lay meticulously organized ledgers. With trembling hands, she flipped through them, discovering the horrifying, obsessive truth. The accounting firm had never existed. It was a multi-billion won front constructed solely to legitimize his presence in her life. He had bought the entire penthouse building just to control who rode the elevator with her. He had bribed city officials, hired private armies disguised as baristas and doormen, and orchestrated every mundane detail of her existence to ensure she remained perfectly, blissfully oblivious. "I had to erase who I was to touch you," a low voice rumbled from the shadows. Katherine spun around. Yang Huck stepped into the blue light, the predatory grace of the syndicate boss clashing with the agonizing vulnerability in his dark eyes. He didn't look at her with the polite distance of the last 4 years. He looked at her like a starving man viewing a feast. "Every enemy I have would have used you to break me," he murmured, closing the distance until the heat of his body radiated against hers. "So I built a cage of gold and glass, and I locked myself outside of it. I didn't ignore you, Katherine. I spent every second of those 4 years restraining myself from dragging you into the dark with me." She stared at the screens, the terrifying gravity of his devotion washing over her. She hadn't been invisible. She had been worshipped from the shadows, entirely consumed by a monster who would burn the world down to keep her safe. The suffocating reality of his confession acted like a physical weight against her chest. The surveillance monitors, the ledgers, the terrifying magnitude of his obsession, it was simply too much. Panic, primal and blinding, overrode her shock. As Jang Hyuk was momentarily distracted by a rapidly ringing encrypted phone on the command console, Katherine did the only thing her fractured mind could process. She ran. She slipped past the command center's heavy doors, navigating the labyrinthine concrete corridors with desperate speed. The compound was vast, but the shifting patrol of the perimeter guards offered a fleeting, dangerous window. Forcing open a heavy steel service door, she spilled out into the biting chill of the estate's sprawling, forested grounds. The night air tore at her lungs, cold and sharp. She scrambled down the manicured slope toward the towering wrought iron fencing that separated the fortress from the dense, looming woods. Freedom was an illusion. She knew that now, but the desperate instinct to flee the monster she married pushed her forward. She reached the perimeter, her hands grasping the freezing metal of the gate, but before she could search for a release mechanism, a distinct metallic click shattered the quiet night. Katherine froze. The shadows between the trees just beyond the fence seemed to detach themselves. 2 men, clad in the same tactical black as the café assailants, stepped into the pale moonlight. Their faces were obscured by night vision goggles, and the suppressed muzzles of their rifles were pointed directly at her chest. The danger wasn't theoretical, it was breathing right in front of her. Jang Hyuk's words echoed mercilessly in her ears. Every enemy I have would have used you to break me." "Look what wandered out of the king's castle," one of the men sneered in Korean, stepping closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. Katherine backed up, her spine hitting the unforgiving iron gate. There was nowhere to run. She braced herself, but instead of a fatal shot, a deafening crack split the air. The man in front of her dropped instantly, a dark hole appearing in his visor. The second man spun, raising his weapon, but a violent shadow erupted from the darkness beside Katherine. Jang Hyuk moved with the terrifying, lethal precision of a striking viper. He didn't bother with his firearm. He closed the gap in a heartbeat, driving a jagged combat knife deep into the second assailant's throat before the man could even scream. The silence that followed was only broken by Katherine's ragged, terrified breathing. Jang Hyuk stood over the bleeding bodies, his chest heaving, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying mix of fury and absolute panic. He dropped the blade and stalked toward her, slamming his hands against the iron gate on either side of her head, caging her completely. "You think I kept you hidden to punish you?" he snarled, his voice trembling with raw, violent emotion. He pressed his forehead against her freezing skin, his breath hot against her freezing skin. "Look at them, Katherine. Look at what is waiting for you outside my walls. I am the only thing standing between you and the wolves." Staring at the lifeless bodies bleeding into the pristine soil, the last remnants of her denial completely evaporated. The cage wasn't just an obsession, it was armor, and the danger outside was very, very real. He didn't let go of her until they were deep inside the reinforced core of the compound, the heavy steel vault doors sealing shut behind them, to block out the scent of blood and winter. Jang Hyuk guided her into a dimly lit study, the crackling fireplace casting long, flickering shadows across the dark mahogany walls. He released her, his broad shoulders suddenly sagging as if the monumental weight of the night had finally fractured his iron spine. He didn't pour a drink, he didn't pace. He simply collapsed into a leather armchair, burying his face in his blood-stained hands. When he finally looked up, the ruthless predator who had butchered 2 men outside was gone. In his place was a man entirely unraveled, the terrifying syndicate boss, replaced by someone agonizingly vulnerable. "I was born into a graveyard, Katherine," he began, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper that commanded the silence of the room. "My father ran the Western districts. He was a brutal man who believed attachment was a fatal liability. When I was 14, a rival syndicate proved him right. They took my mother, my sisters, everyone he had ever shown a sliver of affection to, and they sent them back to us in pieces. I learned that day that in my world, whatever you hold dear simply becomes a target for your enemies to destroy." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the unshed moisture in his dark, desperate eyes. "I spent the next 15 years clawing my way to the top of the underworld, burying everyone who stood in my path. I became a ghost, untouchable, unfeeling, until I walked into that charity gala 4 years ago and saw you." Katherine stood frozen by the fireplace, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was stripping away the last of his armor, completely baring the darkest, most bruised corners of his soul. "You were standing by the glass, laughing at something so incredibly mundane," he murmured, his gaze tracing her features as if memorizing them for the first time without a surveillance screen between them. "You were light, Katherine, pure, untainted light. I knew if I pulled you into my reality, my darkness would extinguish you. My rivals would smell the shift in me. They would know the monster finally had a heart they could cut out." He stood slowly, bridging the distance between them with hesitant, almost reverent steps. He stopped inches away, raising a trembling hand to gently brush a stray, wind-blown curl from her cheek. So I created the accountant, he confessed, his voice breaking. I built a boring, quiet, perfectly safe universe where you could thrive, and I locked myself inside a hollow shell just to be permitted to exist in your orbit. I lied to you because the truth was a death sentence. I starved myself of your touch so that you could live. The silence that followed his confession was heavy, vibrating with a fragile, heartbreaking understanding. Katherine stared at the man she had married, seeing the bleeding, desperate soul beneath the monster's skin. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't see a polite stranger. She saw a guardian who had shattered his own universe to keep hers intact. She reached out, her trembling fingers grazing the bruised knuckles of his hand. Before he could lean into her touch, the quiet intimacy of the study was violently severed. A deafening siren shrieked through the compound, a mechanical scream that rattled the mahogany walls. The warm, flickering firelight was instantly swallowed by the aggressive strobe of crimson emergency lights pulsing from the ceiling. The heavy steel vault doors, designed to be impenetrable, groaned under the sudden automated lockdown sequence. Jang Huk's vulnerability vanished in a millisecond. The broken man evaporated, and the ruthless syndicate king slammed back into place. He moved with terrifying speed, dragging Katherine behind the massive oak desk before activating a hidden panel on the wall. A bank of surveillance monitors roared to life, casting his hardened features in a sinister blood-red glow. "The perimeter is breached," he gritted out, his fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. "They bypassed the outer thermal sensors. That's impossible without the master encrypted bypass codes." Katherine watched the screens in mounting horror. Dozens of heavily armed men in tactical gear were pouring through the main eastern gate, swarming the meticulously manicured grounds. But it wasn't the sheer number of the invading force that made Jang Huk freeze. It was the man leading them inside. On the central monitor, standing by the overridden security terminal, was Minho, the trusted lieutenant who had greeted them at the vehicle just hours before. He was Jang Huk's right hand, the man who had supposedly secured the perimeter. Instead, Minho was calmly disabling the secondary automated turrets, ushering the rival executioners directly into the heart of the fortress. "Minho," Jang Huk whispered, the name dropping from his lips like a curse. The betrayal was a physical blow, colder and sharper than any blade. His own inner circle had sold him out. The perfect cage he had built for Katherine was now a sealed tomb, locking them inside with an army of assassins. The heavy thud of boots and muffled gunfire began to echo through the labyrinth of concrete corridors outside the study. The enemy was already inside the compound walls, executing the loyal guards who had been caught completely unaware by the treason. Jang Huk pulled a heavy matte black firearm from a concealed biometric safe beneath the desk, checking the chamber with a chilling, lethal calmness. He turned to Katherine, his dark eyes burning with the promise of absolute violence. The sanctuary had fallen, and the illusion of safety was dead. Now there was only war. The heavy mahogany door splintered inward under a barrage of gunfire, the explosive noise shattering the last remnants of the world Katherine had known. Dust and concrete debris rained down as the crimson strobe lights illuminated the first wave of assassins breaching the threshold. Jang Hyuk surged forward like a localized hurricane, his weapon barking in rapid, lethal successions. He dropped the first two men instantly, but the hallway was a choked corridor of endless muzzle flashes. Minho's betrayal had delivered them into a hornet's nest. "Stay down," Jang Hyuk roared over the din, using his own body as a shield to drive Katherine deeper into the recess of the reinforced room. He pivoted to blind fire around the edge of the desk, but a stray high-caliber round tore through the heavy wood, followed by a sickening, wet impact. Jang Hyuk gasped, his knees buckling as a dark, blooming stain rapidly saturated the shoulder of his torn white dress shirt. The weapon nearly slipped from his grip, his face draining of color as he slumped against the console. The invincible monster was bleeding. He was mortal. "Jang Hyuk," Katherine cried out, her hands instantly flying to the wound, her palms slick with his warmth. The sheer terror of losing him paralyzed her, but his dark eyes, heavy with pain, locked onto hers with a desperate, fading intensity. With his good hand, he reached beneath the shattered desk and slapped a biometric scanner. A seamless panel in the floor slid open, revealing the dark, concrete mouth of an escape tunnel. A draft of cold air rushed up, whispering of safety, of a path that led far away from the blood and the violence of his world. "The tunnel goes straight to the harbor," he wheezed, his breath rattling in his chest as he forced the heavy, matte black firearm into her trembling hands. His fingers were weak, his strength hemorrhaging into the floorboards. "Go, Katherine. I'll hold the door. They only want me. You can still be free." Katherine stared at the dark abyss of the tunnel, then looked down at the gun in her hands, and finally up at the man who had starved himself of love for 4 years just to keep her breathing. If she ran, she would live, returning to the quiet, invisible existence she had loathed, but he would die here, alone in the dark. The heavy thud of tactical boots grew louder just outside the ruined doorway, accompanied by Min-ho's mocking voice calling out for his former king. A sudden, fierce heat ignited deep within Katherine's chest, burning away the naive, fragile woman who had cowered in the café. The glass cage was entirely shattered, and she was done hiding in the shards. She didn't step toward the tunnel. Instead, she wrapped both hands firmly around the grip of the heavy firearm, braced her weight against the solid frame of the desk, and leveled the barrel at the door. She looked at her bleeding husband, her expression hardening into something unyielding and lethal. She wasn't running. She was going to fight. The acrid smell of cordite hung heavy in the air as Min-ho's silhouette filled the shattered doorway. He stepped over the bodies of the fallen assassins, a smug, triumphant smile twisting his features. He expected to find a dying king and a cowering, helpless wife. He didn't expect the heavy, matte black muzzle of a firearm leveled directly at his chest by a woman whose eyes held absolutely zero hesitation. Katherine didn't waste her breath on words. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil bruised her palms, but the shot cracked through the study, shattering the doorframe mere inches from Min-ho's head. The traitor threw himself backward into the corridor with a shocked shout, desperately signaling for his remaining men to return fire. Bullets chewed through the mahogany desk, but Katherine was already moving, her adrenaline transforming raw terror into a razor-sharp, freezing clarity. She dropped the weapon and lunged toward the blinking security terminal Jang Hook had used to open the escape hatch. The screens were still bathed in the harsh crimson glow of the lockdown. Min-ho had bypassed the outer turrets, but the internal defense grid, the fail-safes meant to protect the heart of the compound, were waiting for a biometric command. Jang Hook's bloodied hand hung limply near the keyboard. "I need you," Katherine breathed, grabbing his heavy, limp hand. She pressed his thumb firmly against the glowing master override scanner. The terminal chimed, a sharp, piercing confirmation that echoed beneath the deafening roar of incoming gunfire. Internal grid online. Katherine didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the touchscreens, fueled by a frantic, intuitive survival instinct. She locked down the blast doors in the eastern wing, trapping the bulk of the invading force. Then she accessed the corridor directly outside the study. On the monitor, she watched Min-ho and half a dozen heavily armed men regrouping for a final breach. She slammed her fist onto the execution command. The ceiling of the hallway outside split open. The deafening, mechanical whir of automated, heavy-caliber sentry turrets dropping into place drowned out Min-ho's sudden scream of panic. Katherine watched the screens as the corridor was instantly consumed by blinding, continuous muzzle flashes. The Syndicate's fail-safes mercilessly tore through the traitors, turning the hunting ground into an inescapable kill zone. Within seconds, the relentless barrage ceased, leaving only the mechanical hum of the turrets and the eerie, ringing silence of the aftermath. Katherine collapsed back against the ruined desk, her chest heaving as the harsh red strobe lights finally slowed. She looked down at Jang Hook. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his dark eyes were open, watching her with a mixture of absolute awe and fierce, undisguised pride. The naive wife in the champagne silk was gone. In her place sat the undisputed queen of his empire, surrounded by the ashes of the men who had dared to threaten her king. The crimson strobe lights finally flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, unfiltered glow of the emergency backups. The heavy scent of gunpowder and copper lingered in the ruined study, a visceral reminder of the blood spilled to protect their throne. Katherine didn't flinch at the carnage beyond the splintered door. Instead, she tore a long strip of fabric from the hem of her ruined champagne silk gown, kneeling beside Jang Hyuk. Her hands, which had trembled in the café just hours ago, were now terrifyingly steady as she bound his bleeding shoulder, pulling the makeshift tourniquet tight. Jang Hyuk winced, but his dark eyes never left her face. The agonizing vulnerability from his earlier confession had vanished, replaced by a profound, burning reverence. He reached up with his uninjured arm, his blood-stained fingers tracing the sharp, unyielding line of her jaw. He was touching not the delicate illusion of the wife he had hidden away, but the fierce, lethal woman who had just decimated his enemies to save his life. "The accountant is truly dead," he murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp that sent a dark thrill down her spine. "He never existed," Katherine replied, her voice cool, steady, and entirely devoid of the fear that had once defined her. She leaned into his touch, no longer shrinking from the violence that coated his skin. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, feeling the heavy, frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. "You built a cage to keep me safe from the monsters, Jang Hyuk. But you forgot that to survive in a world of monsters, you have to be willing to become one." She helped him to his feet, wrapping his heavy arm around her shoulders to bear his weight. Together, they stepped out of the study and into the corridor. The automated turrets retracted into the ceiling with a heavy metallic clank, leaving a path of absolute devastation in their wake. Surviving loyalists were already swarming the hallways, their weapons lowered, their eyes wide as they took in the massacre. They looked past their wounded king and locked eyes with Katherine. The deferential silence that fell over the hardened men wasn't polite or rehearsed, it was born of absolute, terrifying respect. Katherine stood tall amidst the wreckage of the impenetrable compound, supporting the most dangerous man in Seoul. She looked at the empire of blood and shadows that stretched out before them, no longer a captive, a secret, or a pawn. She was a queen surveying her realm. The perfectly safe, mundane life had burned to ashes, and in its place, a dark, unbreakable, and infinitely lethal partnership was forged. She turned her gaze to her husband, meeting his obsessive, possessive stare with an equal, burning intensity, finally ready to rule the underworld by his side. The glass cage is shattered, and a new queen has taken the throne. Will Katherine and Jang Hyuk's lethal partnership conquer the underworld, or will the shadows of Seoul finally consume them both? If you were captivated by Katherine's fierce transformation and this dark descent into the Syndicate's empire, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a thrilling chapter. Our Syndicate is growing, and I want to know how far our reach extends. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly where in the world you are watching from. Until the next story, stay safe, and remember, the most dangerous monsters are sometimes the ones sleeping right beside you.